The next exchange will be between Mark Singleton, who has a PhD in divinity from the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on the history of yoga. His publications include Yoga Body, The Origins of Modern Posture Practice, Roots of Yoga with James Mellinson, and 4 edited volumes of yoga scholarship that, thank God, we mentioned before, because Mark is very humble. So he really sent to us a very short bio. So he was part of the Hatha Yoga project from 2015-2020, hosted by SOAS University of London. And in fact, he is a research associate there. And on the other side, we have Lucy May Constantini, who, as she said, recently submitted her PhD thesis in the School of Religious Studies at the Open University. And she explores the relationship between practice and textual traditions in the South Indian martial art, the Kalaripayattu. And her interdisciplinary research encompasses ethnography and the study of manuscripts in Malayalam and Sanskrit. Lucy's methodology is informed by her background as a dance artist, where her work has invested the confluence of martial arts, yoga, and postmodern dance as a maker, performer, facilitator, and teacher in the UK and internationally. She has also been engaged with yoga either as a practitioner, teacher, or teacher trainer for over 3 decades. And she has also worked in radio broadcast journalism, including producing an hour-long documentary for BBC English regions on the relationship between dance and spiritual practice. And I'm very happy and excited to have you both here talking about the volume, which is, because I didn't mention that, probably we should, Yoga and Traditional Physical Practices of South Asia, Influence, Entanglement and Confrontation.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I feel like I've spoken a lot this morning. So hopefully this will be coherent. So this volume was published open access by the Journal of Yoga Studies. You can download it there, and you can also, I think it's print on demand. And it was edited by Mark Singleton and also Daniela Bevilacqua. And it came about initially through a workshop that was held at SOAS as part of the Hatha Yoga project in November 2019, where the authors brought together a whole range of scholars from a whole range of disciplines to look at different embodied practices that might or might not have had some kind of entanglement with yogasana. So I'm going to try and give a brief overview of this really broad-ranging book. So the prelude is by Jason Birch and Jacqueline Hargreaves, and that's looking at pre-modern yoga asanas and modern postural practice. And in that chapter, they're looking at 3 collections of asanas that move across divides of sect, language, and geography. And if I've remembered correctly, these are from the 18th and 19th centuries. And what they, through a very interesting kind of pathway through, we discover that 2 of these 3 texts go from yogis to royal court. So we see a big sociological transition. And another 2 of them end up as a major part of like what we now think of as global yoga. So they're disseminated internationally. So just the relationship of these texts to what is going on more recently. So we then move into like the first sort of segment of the volume, and it's called Yogis, Acrobats or Dancers. And a real theme of this is the blurring of boundaries in terms of definitions of what people do and identities. Like when is it a yogi? When is it an acrobat? When is it a dancer? And is it always clear? When is it a wrestler? So the first in that section is a chapter by Seth Powell on Vijayanagara temples in the Deccan, and he's in particular looking at sculptures there and making a real case for the shared performative context, and again this blurring of identity, like how can you tell who is what when. And then there's a chapter by Suran, I hope I say this, I'm not great on Thai names, Subsanti Wongse, and it's on a text called the Samrajya Lakshmi Pitaka, which is a manual on tantric rituals and stagecraft. And in particular, he's looking at the Navaratri amusements that are performed for the king every year. And again, we see this blurring of identity of the performers and these environments that are conducive to the exchange of physical praxis, maybe between practitioners of different kinds of practices. And then we have Elisa Ganser, who writes on dance, particular as ritual offering, and what she calls imitatio Dei in classical Indian theatre tradition. So she refers to the Natya Shastra in this, and she argues that dance as a ritual offering is also akin to certain yogic practices in certain contexts. And she kind of questions what it is when the body is an instrument of religious experience, again, in these different contexts. So how do you then start interpreting what happens where? Okay, that's that section. Then we come to the next section, which is martial arts, pole, and exercise. So it begins with Philippe Rochard and Oliver Bast's chapter on, again, apologies for any mispronunciations, Zurkane, and Arkaras and Jeshtimalas. So basically, the Turco-Persian wrestling milieu of the mid-13th to the end of the 16th centuries, and the Jeshtimalas of Gujarat. So what or what is not the interaction between those? Followed by Patrick McCartney's chapter on Malakam. So the pole, acrobatics, yoga, however you want to describe it. And again, we've got this sense of fluidity of roles going on. This really seems to be a key theme. And then Jerome Armstrong gives us a chapter on Vyayama, which is sort of exertion, exercise. So traditional Indian forms of Vyayama, and particularly building on his specialty of Bengal yoga and the yoga that emerged from there. Is there a connection? And he concludes that many asanas that appeared in the 20th century as part of what we now think of as modern yoga, which Mark Singleton has written so much about, were at one point part of the Vyayama system. So there's some kind of clear association. Stuart Ray Sarbacher on Surya Namaskar, the sun salutations. Is it a physical practice? Is it a religious prostration? Well, it turns out it can be both. Again, we have a blurring of boundaries. Laura Silvestri's chapter on Kalaripayata. So she's working with a Muslim master in northern Kerala, looking at concepts of wind and fire, and also how this particular master adopted notions of yoga because kind of people were asking for it, and then decided that actually he wasn't so comfortable incorporating this notion of yoga into his Kalaripayata terminology. And then there's my chapter, which looks a little bit more detailed at what the notion of posture in Kalaripayata is, which obviously has certain relationships to yoga. And then we move to China and Tibet. Dominic Stiavu looking at Dao Yin, guiding vital breath and stretching the body. That's what it's translated as. It's a practice that goes back to the 2nd century BCE, so it's very old. And he points out that Jean-François Filiosa noticed the links between Taoism and yoga back in 1949. And there's not been an enormous amount of scholarship since. David Gordon White, who spoke earlier, has done some of that. And he posits the problem that part of the reason for that is that in order really to look at this kind of flow of information, you need to be a specialist in China, Tibet, Persia, and India. And most scholars are one or two of those and not all of them. Dolly Yang looks at the relationship between Naidan, inner alchemy, which is a later practice, and the yoga of the Amrita Siddhi, which is an 11th century, if I've got that date right, Hatha Yoga manual that was part of the Hatha Yoga Project's research. And then Ian Baker takes us around various magical wheels of Tibetan yoga. And then rounding us all off, Joseph Alter does a very generous afterword, actually, where he looks at the semiotic theory to examine embodied meaning and methodological questions on how it is that we compare varieties of physical practice. So what is the self of self-development and what is the body of embodied practice? So I think I've gone way over time, so I'm going to pause there. And my first question for Mark is that, from what I understand, this project wasn't originally part of the Hatha Yoga project proposal. So what was it that pushed you to include what is like a massive spectrum of practices? And so how did you come to this, basically?
Well, no, it wasn't part of the original proposal. I think, as I remember, the first time Daniela and I spoke about it was in Jim Mallinson's Jeep driving across Gujarat, and it's something that I'd been. Many of the questions that are raised, and some of which are answered in this volume, were questions that have been sort of following me around for about 20 years. In particular, the relationship between yogasana and dance, the possible influences or sort of entanglements with China and Tibet, and lots more. And so we decided that, well, I think the project, I considered it, I think, as a monograph at one point, and then gone, this is impossible. You just can't do this. So Daniela had the idea of an edited volume, to which I said, no way, I'm not doing another one of those. But eventually we did, and we started to think about who might be able to speak to some of these questions we had, and started putting out calls for papers. And then had this workshop in London, at which point I think there's several, if not many of those people, several of the contributors here and here today. I think at which point we knew there was something really very interesting going on here, and that then led into this which is very long. It's sort of an A4 format, and there's I think it's 540 pages, so that's about 1,000 pages if you put it into a normal format. And so we cast the net very wide, and I think we have we sort of gathered really a wealth of interesting and very, very rich research on sort of physical practices that may or may not be allied to the development of Hatha Yoga. So that, I think that's how it came about. But I'd also like to say, of course, Daniela, please do chip in. It's not, obviously this isn't just me. This is a co-edited volume. So do if you have anything to say, Daniela.
No, you're going very well. Go ahead, Mark.
And I'd also like to say at this point, just to say, the symposium marks the 20th anniversary of Elizabeth de Michaelis's book, and of course that book and Elizabeth herself have been sort of extremely important, key to my own sort of development as a scholar, my own direction, and so I just want to honor that and sort of express my immense gratitude to Elizabeth and the work she's done.
It's really great to have you both here as part of that cycle. So yeah, so from this process of putting this hugely diverse book together and making a kind of coherent whole of it, like what did you learn from that? Was there anything that surprised you? Did it affect the direction of the research you were doing in any particular way?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is a coherent whole. And what Beth thinks. I mean, it's big, and there are many loose ends. There are many avenues for future research. There's we were talking about, you were talking about the the reason why the sort of Chinese thing, the Chinese yogas and Daoyin and Neidan haven't been studied in relation to India, I mean, it's sort of crying out for a, you know, for a larger sort of cross-disciplinary investigation there. I think on the basis alone of the two chapters in the volume by Dominic Stevieu and Dolly Yang, I learned an awful lot. I mean, a tremendous amount from all of the contributions. I mean, I'm talking about the, you know, the Chinese elements. I knew virtually nothing about that, and that was one of the questions, in fact, that have been following me around. That, you know, people would ask in terms of the genealogies of asanas and of hatha yoga. Is there such a thing as Chinese yoga, which is, of course, the title of one of the chapters? And we you know, we had Needham a long time ago, sort of pointing us in that direction. Jeffrey Samuel, sort of, you know, making suggestions about that kind of connection. Livia Cohen, of course, doing the same thing in a volume that I edited in 2008, I think it was. But, you know, nothing of that kind of depth. And I think those two chapters together, for me, just because I know less about that material, were quite really surprising and quite enriching. In particular, this odd thing that happens in a Daoyin text of the 6th or 7th century, where 18 postures appear. That are called the Indian massage method, or Brahminic calisthenics, as Dominic translates them, which is quite remarkable. Like, what do you do with that? Because that seems to, you might have expected it to sort of go the other way, which it also appears, you know, this sort of constant exchange back and forth, you know. And then the question then is, are these Indian practices that got naturalized into Daoyin? Or is this a kind of marketing technique? You know, is this a way to sort of make your Chinese practices more interesting by saying that they're from India? So, you know, those sorts of things, in that respect, anyway. And Dolly Yang, of course, her I think exceptionally well carried out comparison between the Amrita Siddhi, as you say, that 11th century text, which of course is in some respects foundational to Hatha Yoga. You know, that sort of first text that describes these practices, which later become foundational practices of Hatha Yoga, and the comparison there with Neidan from the practices from the 5th century, and you know, the sort of the shared body of practices, from bodily inversions, inverting the body, upside down poses, breath control, the alchemical language, circulating the vital essence, the chi or the prana, the retention of semen, of course, which is, you know, that key sort of Hatha Yoga concept, reversing its flow, a kind of idea of Jivan Mukti as well, sort of, you know, enlightenment within the body. And so, you know, like, I hesitate always to talk about influence, you know, to sort of, well, you know, those correspondences nonetheless are extremely suggestive. Jürgen just said, you know, just said, I think, you know, Hatha Yoga is a completely different thing. If you're coming from the study of Patanjali or sort of meditative yoga tradition, suddenly you've got this other kind of practice. And so, you know, putting that beside the Chinese, these Chinese practices, I think, is at the least extremely suggestive and definitely worthy of further research. So that's one thing. I don't know if you want to chip in, Daniela, or whether we...
No. I mean, there were so many things I didn't know. So, because as Jürgen said, when I started the Hatha Yoga project, I started to focus on the field of yoga studies. So for me, there were a lot of things that were like to unpack, and I think the volume could be considered as a kind of starting point, because many more practices and ideas should be compared, and especially one chapter that is missing and instead was part. I mean, there are a couple of participants in the workshop who actually were not able to contribute with the chapters in the volume, like Shubha Marora, for example, who was looking at the presence of the, let's say, the yogic vocabulary in the Kama Shastra textual sources. That, again, I mean, for me, that was super surprising, and it's a pity that we don't have that chapter. But I think, you know, we could create, maybe other editors probably, a second volume of that, with, you know, putting together more efforts and more contributions and more practices and context in which these terms or techniques were used. Yes.
Actually, one of the questions, Daniela or Mark, whoever, like, where does this go? Like, how do you extend this or refine it or develop it in terms of, because it just seems to me it's such a broad spectrum. So how do you choose, or where would you put it next?
I guess that's up to others to sort of take it on. I don't think I'm not planning on taking any of the elements of here and going further with them. My sort of research interests are going in a slightly different direction now. But I mean, that kind of slippage that you speak about in the word, well, in the various terms. So for example, in Elisa Ganser's chapter, you know, words like asana, sthana, shrama, sort of key words that appear. The first association is with yoga. If you come from a sort of yoga studies background, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a yoga studies person, everything looks like yoga. And I think so sort of tracing the edges of that term and the terms within it is extremely necessary. So as not to sort of, and maybe Lucy, you can also speak to that, because you're also a contributor here, that sort of projection of yoga onto other disciplines, that, you know, the assumption that Vayu is a yogic Vayu in a different context, for example, those sorts of things. I think, you know, finding the edges of those of the meanings of those terms is extremely helpful perhaps in a world where we're dominated by yoga studies, or we're, you know, within that looking out.
No, I think that's very true. And also because, certainly in my experience, that the disciplines have their own iteration and their own definitions and their own way of practicing with these terms, like Vayu, for example. And actually, one of the things that I came across when I was looking at the volume, which I hadn't realized, so the term malan in the Kalari text appears every now and then, or a malan, you know, this particular posture will help you defeat even a malan opponent. And in the Malayalam, the malan is like a big, strong opponent, or an opponent who's stronger than you. And of course, reading then the Philippe Rochard and Bast chapter and Patrick McCartney's chapter on Malakam, I was like, oh, a malan is a wrestler. So it gives you this sense of like terms that have traveled, and also, especially because ethnographically, the person I deal with talks about this this migration of practices, as he sees it, down the west coast of India. And I don't know what there is in that, but you've certainly got a terminology that flows through. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can also mention that the sort of, I think another, hopefully the sort of thing that we're talking about, you know, where do things go from here? I mean, in terms of Surya Namaskar and the that whole sort of wrestling martial arts exercise, all of that sort of, that part of the book anyway, the second part, I think already it's sort of creating some kind of conversation. I mean, just Philippe Rochard's conclusion, or his, is that no, there isn't the interchange between Persia and India in those terms is not really about the interchange of particular postures or exercises. It's more in the art of war, in warfare, in gunpowder, in elephants, the kind of technologies of war. And there's also the well-attested influence on Sufism by yogis and vice versa, that sort of exchange that's been so well studied by Carl Ernst. But there's an article again in the Journal of Yoga Studies coming out next year by James Dillon Russell, which is about Surya Namaskar, and he does a very good job of sort of looking at the work of Stuart Sarbacher, Elliot Goldberg, Joseph Alter, and so on, who've written about Surya Namaskar, and says actually you can trace this very, very directly, the Surya Namaskar, back to Persian exercises. And so I think it's sort of something will happen, not least of all because there's so many loose ends, and that it's so sort of big and many faceted, the book.
Great. So have we got any other questions coming in, Daniela? Because I've got one here if there's none from the floor.
No, you can go ahead with your question. Yeah.
So it refers to something that Joseph Alter, a phrase he used in his afterword, which was the attention to physiology and philology, which he talked about kind of spanning the course of the book. But it also made me think that actually it was quite a good description of some aspects of the Hatha Yoga project. So I just wanted to put that to you and see what you had to say about it.
What do you mean? Say a bit more. I'm not sure what
yeah, that maybe wasn't very clear. So an academic inquiry, a methodological inquiry that looks at, because I think I take it for granted when I'm looking at yoga embodied praxis that you might be looking at something that in a philological way, but your attention is on physiology, it's on the body. And actually, I think that's quite unusual. That's probably quite particular to the discipline and the field. So I just wondered if you had something to say about that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to put my headphones in. I'm getting distracted invaded by a toddler.
Well, we had a cat earlier, so cats and
toddlers. Yeah, the cat. Okay. Yeah. Physiology and philology, like how to go about sort of studying those, and I think that relates to a question from the earlier session about would this be a question about sort of embodied research and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of where you want to take it. I was just intrigued by that phrase, and I wondered what you made of it. Maybe that wasn't.
Daniela, if you just let me shoo this person away. He said, well, Constantini.
Well, we said we were an informal symposium, so this is good.
I mean, I think the volume tried actually to cover, perhaps to expand a bit this a way to unite these two aspects. Like, there was a lot of philological efforts, a lot of and it's still going on, a lot of critical editions. So it was perhaps from our side, we were more into, let's say, contemporary world, the practitioners and so on, a way to look for the practitioners or of other embodied practices. Indeed, a bit more like Patricia was saying, like, when you focus too much the attention on philosophy, philology, and sometimes it's also good to look at other perspectives, right? And just to make the full picture more complicated. And I mean, that's why, we didn't, as Mark said, there wasn't a conclusion. We couldn't say anything like, okay, we can say that this happened, because everything becomes more complex when you look at, you put together this philology and physiology together. But that's the best of of the research field, I think, because as Mark was saying, mentioning this other scholar, that's just the beginning. The field is open, and I'm glad about that. Like you know, a lot of more scholars increasing and developing the field of yoga studies. What would you say, Mark?
Yeah, I'd say that the book represents many bodies, many different kinds of bodies, yogic bodies, and others, bodies of, you know, the bodies going into war, but you know, dancing bodies, and so there we get to reflect on what a physical discipline means in these various contexts, whether. And that also that kind of the transition between, say, the context of temple entertainment to the stage, to, well, temple entertainment in the context of you know, entertaining a king or acrobatics, to the sort of a further layer of theorizing in the Natya Shastra, for example, where actually that what might appear entertainment becomes a path towards moksha. So not yoga. It's you know, at least according to Elisa's chapter, you know, it's not hatha yoga. You know, that sort of what you might think in those temple friezes are hatha yoga postures are not. They're just a frozen dance move. But nevertheless, you have that passage into something, into a different kind of path towards moksha, basically there. So I think, you know, looking at embodiment and in those particular contexts is where to find the kind of those sort of the gray areas, you know, like I'm you know, quite suspicious of that sort of, you know, influence notion, as if one thing sort of, you know, creates another, but that coexistence of two distinct disciplines with very fuzzy boundaries, I think is the most interesting place to look.
Well, and also bodies don't necessarily only do one discipline, do they? As we know.
Right.
So yeah, did Vicky have a question?
I do, yeah. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Lucy. My question relates to something Elizabeth said earlier, actually, in our introduction about yoga reaching this age of virtuosity. And I just wondered if, Mark, you have any reflections on that as a concept, the changing nature of yoga as a physical practice in a digital world, and also potentially interesting pathways of future study on that theme.
Well, I'm actually writing a book on sort of on that topic. I'm writing a book about yoga in relation to technology. So you know, I think the virtual and what that means to be a body. It's interesting to reflect on that generally, but also through the lens of yoga, where virtual realities are already having quite an impact on how people practice and where they practice. So in terms of a kind of physicality, also, I mean, in terms of a kind of automation, perhaps, of yoga and yoga practices, and a further standardization. There's a lot to say, but that kind of the idea of a virtual yoga, or even a virtual Atman, you know, sort of a kind of spiritual practice that takes place in a realm that's not quite, or not only, a sort of unenhanced physical reality. I think within that there's a lot of room for reflecting on what it is that yoga does, and what yoga is and does, and the subject that is the yogi. So I'll tell you more when the book comes out.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Mark.
Mark, indeed, can you mention briefly when, I mean, your book, the title and everything, because we wanted to include it, but it was a bit slow in the publishing process, right?
Yeah, it was a bit slow. So it's called Yoga Machine, and then the subtitle is probably going to be something like transhumanism, technology and transcendence, something like that, something, you know, alliterative. And it's probably going to be published with Penguin next year.
Okay. That's good. You don't want to spoil a bit the content. Little
Let's talk about this
spoiler.
book. Let's talk about this
No,
book.
just because we have 3 minutes, and I don't know if we will have more time. If you will be at the end of this symposium tomorrow, will you be with us tomorrow at the end?
No.
So that's why. So yeah, if you can tell us a little bit more about the content of your book, will be great, because we were thinking about mentioning that tomorrow with you, but if you are not there, you have a couple of minutes, and we would love to, yeah, if you want to do that, Mark.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can give you a brief sort of overview of what's happening in the book, if that seems interesting. So well, let's just start at the beginning, really. I make a claim, which, you know, more sort of as a way to sort of open an inquiry, that is that modern yoga, this project of modern yoga, theorized originally by Elizabeth, of course, is essentially technological yoga. That we should, that there is no, that we can define modern yoga as technological yoga, and by doing so, certain things come into view that weren't visible before. And I start with Vivekananda and his arrival at the World's Parliament of Religions, which was a sort of subset of this Colombian World's Fair, which celebrated essentially modern technology, modern industry and technology and science. So Vivekananda sort of arrived within this, and so I start there, sort of, you know, tracing an idea which I think is present in Vivekananda and elsewhere, that yoga itself is a technology, and that's sort of a, you know, it's a major cliche in the sort of modern yoga world. You can, you know, just searching in Google, yoga is a technology, everybody sort of seems to agree. And well, Jim Mallinson and myself said a similar thing in the introduction to Roots of Yoga, that Hatha Yoga is a floating technology. And I think that sort of has prepared the ground for a sort of ease with which ideas about contemporary smart technology, let's say, and artificial intelligence and so on, can merge with yoga. So just to give you a sense of the overview, I give a little bit of an overview of yoga and science and technology in the 20th century. I'm talking about the Internet of Bodies, modern postural yoga, and the kind of haptic technology, and how that works in terms of doing a practice, what that means to, you know, what kind of a practitioner is formed. I'm looking at neural yoga, I call it, following on from some Buddhist scholars who are talking about neural Buddhism, and a kind of tracking culture within yoga. And then hacking. Who said hacking earlier? I think it was Jürgen, wasn't it, saying that Hatha Yoga was a way of hacking the body. So that sort of idea, which, you know, that metaphor, which is, of course, you know, a very modern metaphor that also you can find everywhere. Yoga is biohacking. I'm sort of looking at that, and also sort of investigating what that means. Tell me when I'm running out of time, because I don't want to go over on this. You know, what that might mean. What if yoga is a biohack, then where does that lead us? What does that mean? Is that absurd, or is that something that can be used? Is that something that might be acceptable, let's say, even to a pre-modern, yogi from the 12th century, transported in time, from India to Silicon Valley, that kind of thing. And then also you're looking at virtual yoga, virtual yogis, and that phenomenon as a sort of cultural history there of luxury yoga retreats in VR. That's to say, the idea of full dive VR and the experience machine, of course, that sort of old thought experiment, and what happens if you transfer that to the yoga experience machine? I think something quite different happens. So it's that kind of thing, and tracing a history of transhumanism within the history of yoga, seeing if is it the same thing or not, etc., etc. And so yeah, I'm very interested in the panel later on media and gurus.